Long before the most famous battles of World War II were fought, long before tanks crossed borders and bombers filled the sky, the fate of the war was already being quietly shaped by something far less visible and far more decisive. While armies trained for confrontation and nations prepared their people for sacrifice, a different kind of battlefield was forming in silence, one where no shots were fired and no medals were awarded. This battlefield was built on information, on secrecy, and on the simple truth that knowing the enemy better than he knows himself is often more powerful than any weapon ever forged. What made the United States dangerous in this invisible war was not arrogance or improvisation, but organization. While other powers treated intelligence as a support tool, America began to understand it as a central pillar of modern warfare. Information was no longer something gathered after events unfolded. It was something used to shape those events before they ever occurred. Decisions were no longer based on instinct alone, but on patterns, intercepted communications, decoded messages, and the quiet accumulation of data that revealed how the enemy thought, planned, and reacted. For many of America's enemies, this shift went unnoticed for far too long. They believed wars were still decided primarily by firepower and maneuver. They focused on secrecy and isolation, assuming that protecting individual operations was enough. What they failed to see was that the United States was building something broader, something far more systematic. Intelligence was no longer fragmented. It was centralized, analyzed, cross-checked, and transformed into actionable understanding. This was not about knowing one secret. It was about seeing the entire picture. As the war expanded, so did the American intelligence apparatus. Agencies that once operated separately began to coordinate. Military branches that once guarded their information began to share it. Analysts, linguists, mathematicians, engineers, and field operatives were brought together under a single purpose: to turn raw information into strategic advantage faster than any enemy could respond. This integration was not dramatic. It was methodical, and because it lacked spectacle, it was often underestimated. Meanwhile, small cracks began to appear on the other side. Not dramatic betrayals at first, but minor leaks, overlooked transmissions, habits repeated too often, and assumptions left unquestioned. In isolation, none of these seemed catastrophic. Together, they formed a pattern, and patterns once recognized are devastating in war. American intelligence did not rely on a single source or a single breakthrough. It relied on accumulation. Every intercepted message added context. Every captured document filled a gap. Every defector, every careless transmission, every repeated routine made the enemy more predictable. Over time, this predictability became a vulnerability so severe that entire operations could be anticipated before they began. Movements were no longer surprises. They were confirmations. What made this especially powerful was that the enemy often never realized what had been compromised. Plans continued to be executed with confidence, unaware that their outlines were already known. Decisions were made believing secrecy had been preserved, while in reality they were being observed, measured, and quietly neutralized. This was not victory achieved through confrontation, but through invisibility. For the American war effort, this meant something extraordinary. Resources could be allocated more efficiently. Risks could be calculated more precisely. Battles could be avoided, delayed, or reshaped based on information rather than desperation. Soldiers were no longer sent blindly into uncertainty. Behind them stood a system that had already mapped the enemy's intentions. This shift marked a turning point in the nature of warfare itself. The United States was no longer reacting to the war as it unfolded. It was influencing its direction from behind the scenes. While the world focused on explosions and headlines, the real struggle was being decided in rooms filled with maps, intercepted signals, and analysts working in near anonymity. And it was there, in that quiet environment, that one uncomfortable truth began to take shape. The side that controlled information did not need to win every battle. It only needed to make sure the enemy never truly understood why he was losing. This was the beginning of the silent collapse. Not the collapse of armies, but of certainty. And once certainty is gone, even the strongest forces begin to weaken from within. As this invisible struggle intensified, the true power of American intelligence began to reveal itself, not through dramatic victories, but through consistency. The United States did not depend on a single brilliant spy or a single decisive interception. Instead, It relied on an ecosystem of information where small pieces, collected patiently over time, were assembled into a picture so complete that it became difficult for the enemy to move without being noticed. This was not luck. It was design. One of the most dangerous misconceptions held by America's enemies was the belief that secrecy was binary. Either a plan was secret, or it was compromised. What they failed to understand was that secrecy erodes gradually. A message intercepted here, a routine observed there, a pattern repeated too often. None of these alone seemed fatal, but together, they transformed uncertainty into predictability. And predictability, in war, is a death sentence. American analysts learned to think in terms of behavior rather than messages. They studied timing, frequency, and repetition. They noticed how often certain units moved, how long preparations usually took, and how command structures reacted under pressure. Even when communications were encrypted, habits still spoke. The enemy believed his words were hidden, but his behavior was not. Over time, this behavioral intelligence became more valuable than any single decoded message. This approach allowed the United States to anticipate actions without needing perfect information. It meant that even when details were missing, intent could still be inferred. Plans no longer appeared suddenly. They announced themselves quietly through patterns. And once those patterns were understood, entire operations could be predicted days or even weeks in advance. What made this particularly devastating was that the enemy often mistook silence for safety. When no obvious leaks were discovered, confidence grew. Operations proceeded under the assumption that secrecy had held. In reality, secrecy had already failed, but in a way that left no visible trace. There were no alarms, no betrayals uncovered, no dramatic moments of exposure, only outcomes that increasingly favored one side. This asymmetry created a growing imbalance. American commanders began to operate with a level of foresight that appeared almost uncanny. They avoided unnecessary risks, reinforced the right positions, and allocated resources with remarkable precision. To the outside observer, it seemed as if they were simply more cautious or more disciplined. But beneath that appearance lay an information advantage that shaped every decision. For the enemy, the effect was corrosive. Plans that should have succeeded failed without obvious explanation. Ambushes met prepared defenses. Movements encountered resistance too quickly to be coincidence. At first, these failures were attributed to bad luck or local mistakes. But as they accumulated, doubt began to spread. Confidence in leadership weakened. Trust within command structures eroded. When results consistently defy expectation, belief itself becomes fragile. This was one of the most powerful outcomes of the intelligence war. The United States did not need to expose its knowledge. It only needed to let the enemy experience the consequences of being known. Confusion replaced certainty. Suspicion replaced confidence. Every failure raised the question of what else might be compromised. And yet, even as doubt spread, the enemy struggled to identify the source of the problem. Intelligence failures are notoriously difficult to diagnose from the inside. When information is incomplete, every explanation feels plausible. Was it betrayal? Was it incompetence? Was it coincidence? The inability to answer these questions decisively created paralysis at the highest levels of command. Meanwhile, the American system continued to function quietly, efficiently, and relentlessly. Information flowed inward, was analyzed, and returned outward as advantage. No single component was indispensable. No single failure could undo the whole. This resilience ensured that the intelligence effort could survive mistakes without collapsing, a trait that mirrored the broader American war machine. By this stage of the conflict, the war on the battlefield was increasingly shaped by decisions made far away from it. The enemy still believed he was fighting soldiers and machines. In reality, he was fighting an understanding of his own behavior, his own limitations, and his own vulnerabilities. And that understanding was tightening its grip. As this grip tightened, the war of information began to influence not just operations, but the psychology of entire command structures. When leaders can no longer trust the integrity of their plans, decision-making slows, hesitation grows, and initiative erodes. This is one of the least visible yet most destructive effects of intelligence dominance. The enemy may still possess weapons, manpower, and resources, but without confidence in secrecy, Every action becomes a gamble, and war does not favor those who hesitate. American intelligence understood this dynamic well. The objective was not simply to collect information, but to shape the environment in which the enemy made decisions. By allowing certain operations to fail while others proceeded, patterns of uncertainty were deliberately reinforced. The enemy could never be certain whether failure was the result of poor execution, internal betrayal, or an unseen observer. This ambiguity was intentional, and it proved devastating. Over time, this uncertainty forced the enemy to divert attention inward. Resources that should have been focused on the battlefield were redirected toward internal investigations. Commanders began to suspect their own subordinates. Entire units were scrutinized, questioned, and reorganized. In some cases, experienced officers were removed not because of proven disloyalty, but because trust itself had become fragile. The intelligence war was no longer external. It had moved inside the enemy's own structure. This internal pressure compounded existing stresses. War already demands extreme endurance from those who lead it. When doubt is added to that burden, judgment suffers. Decisions become reactive rather than strategic. Leaders grow cautious, avoiding bold moves not because they are unwise but because failure feels inevitable. Initiative, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to recover. Meanwhile, the American system continued to benefit from the opposite condition. Confidence, not arrogance, but confidence rooted in preparation and verification. Decisions were supported by information, cross-checked through multiple sources, and evaluated for risk with a clarity unavailable to the enemy. This allowed American commanders to act decisively while appearing measured. The contrast was striking, and it widened with every passing month. The intelligence advantage also altered how time itself was experienced on both sides. For the enemy, time became compressed. Deadlines felt urgent. Windows of opportunity seemed to close quickly. Every delay was perceived as dangerous. For the United States, time expanded. Decisions could be paced. Operations could be sequenced. Pressure was applied where it mattered most, not everywhere at once. This control over tempo is one of the most decisive advantages in any conflict, and it was achieved without the enemy fully understanding how. What made this imbalance especially difficult to counter was that it left no clear target. There was no single headquarters to destroy, no individual whose removal would reverse the situation. The intelligence system was distributed, resilient, and adaptive. Even if one channel was compromised, others remained intact. The enemy could sense the presence of an unseen force shaping outcomes, but could not grasp its form. As frustration mounted, mistakes multiplied. In attempts to restore secrecy, procedures were changed hastily. New codes were introduced without sufficient testing. Communication protocols became more complex, increasing the likelihood of error. Ironically, efforts to regain control often made the system more fragile rather than less. Complexity replaced clarity, and confusion followed. By this stage, the intelligence war had achieved something remarkable. It had transformed the enemy's own efforts to protect himself into a source of vulnerability. Every adjustment carried risk. Every new measure created potential exposure. The more desperately secrecy was pursued, the more elusive it became. This was not a failure of courage or discipline. It was the natural consequence of fighting an opponent who had already learned how to see patterns where others saw noise, and how to exploit understanding rather than force. The battlefield remained violent and unpredictable, but beneath it ran a current of inevitability shaped by information. And with each passing decision made in doubt rather than confidence, the outcome of the war moved closer to its conclusion. By this point in the war, the intelligence advantage had become so deeply embedded in American operations that it no longer felt exceptional. It felt normal. Information flowed as naturally as logistics, feeding decisions with a quiet confidence that required no explanation. What had once been an experiment in coordination had matured into doctrine. Intelligence was no longer something that supported the war effort. It was the war effort, shaping movements, priorities, and outcomes before physical force ever entered the equation. For the enemy, this shift was nearly impossible to comprehend in real time. Traditional military thinking had conditioned leaders to look for threats in visible places: troop concentrations, supply lines, weapons systems. The idea that the most decisive blows were being delivered through understanding rather than destruction was deeply unsettling. It meant that even flawless execution on the battlefield could not compensate for strategic blindness. Success required not just strength, but awareness, and awareness was precisely what was slipping away. American intelligence excelled at exploiting this gap. By combining intercepted communications, human sources, aerial reconnaissance, and behavioral analysis, a layered picture emerged that was far more accurate than any single source could provide. Each layer reinforced the others, reducing uncertainty and increasing confidence. This multi-source approach ensured that decisions were not based on assumption, but on convergence. When multiple indicators pointed in the same direction, action could be taken with remarkable assurance. This convergence allowed American planners to anticipate not just what the enemy might do, but how he would react when plans failed. Contingencies were prepared not as abstract possibilities, but as expected developments. This anticipation stripped the enemy of surprise, one of the most valuable assets in war. Even when operations unfolded differently than predicted, the range of possible outcomes had already been narrowed. Nothing truly unexpected remained. As a result, the enemy's freedom of action diminished steadily. Choices became constrained by fear of exposure. Movements were delayed, rerouted, or abandoned entirely due to the suspicion that they had already been compromised. In trying to protect secrets, the enemy began to limit himself, reducing operational flexibility at precisely the moment when adaptability was most needed. This self-imposed restriction created a compounding effect. Reduced flexibility led to predictability. Predictability fed intelligence. Intelligence further reduced flexibility. The cycle reinforced itself, tightening the strategic environment until options all but disappeared. What remained were reactive decisions made under pressure, with diminishing returns and increasing risk. Throughout this process, American intelligence maintained a critical advantage: restraint. Knowledge was not flaunted. Successes were not advertised. Operations were allowed to appear mundane, even clumsy at times, to avoid revealing the depth of understanding behind them. This discipline prevented the enemy from identifying the true source of his difficulties. Without a clear adversary to confront, frustration turned inward. Internally, this frustration manifested as second-guessing and erosion of trust. Orders were questioned. Reports were scrutinized excessively. Initiative declined as officers waited for confirmation that never fully arrived. In environments where confidence is essential, uncertainty became corrosive. The chain of command, once a source of strength, became a conduit for doubt. What made this situation especially dire was that it could not be resolved through increased effort alone. No amount of bravery, sacrifice, or aggression could restore lost awareness. The enemy was expending energy without gaining clarity, while the United States was gaining clarity without expending unnecessary force. This asymmetry drained morale in ways that battlefield losses never could. By the time this imbalance was fully recognized, it had already reshaped the war beyond reversal. The intelligence struggle had reached a point where outcomes were being determined not by isolated actions, but by the accumulation of small, informed decisions consistently made in one direction. The war had become a process rather than a contest, and processes, once optimized, are extraordinarily difficult to defeat. As the war entered its later stages, the consequences of this intelligence imbalance became impossible to ignore, even for those who had once dismissed it as coincidence or exaggeration. Operations that should have altered the course of the conflict failed before they truly began. Movements were intercepted, supply lines disrupted at critical moments, and offensives met resistance that felt uncannily prepared. To those on the receiving end, it no longer felt like facing an enemy reacting to events. It felt like facing an enemy who already knew them. This sensation was deeply destabilizing. Soldiers and commanders alike began to question not only their plans, but the very process by which those plans were conceived. Every delay raised suspicion. Every unexpected resistance triggered doubt. The battlefield became a place where outcomes felt predetermined, as if decisions had already been made elsewhere, beyond reach and beyond correction. This psychological erosion was subtle, but relentless, and it sapped the energy required to sustain prolonged resistance. In contrast, the American approach grew increasingly confident, though rarely overt. Intelligence allowed resources to be concentrated precisely where they would matter most. Effort was not wasted chasing illusions or responding to feints. Instead, actions were guided by probability and verification. When force was applied, it was applied with purpose. When restraint was chosen, it was chosen with understanding. This discipline created an impression of inevitability that spread quietly through every theater of the war. What made this phase particularly decisive was that it revealed the limits of counterintelligence when faced with a system built for learning. Attempts to close leaks and tighten secrecy were met with diminishing returns. The enemy was fighting yesterday's intelligence war, focusing on preventing individual failures rather than addressing the systemic patterns that made failure unavoidable. Each new measure introduced complexity, and complexity created new opportunities for error. At the same time, the pressure to maintain secrecy under deteriorating conditions led to increasingly rigid controls. Communication slowed, approval chains lengthened, flexibility vanished. These measures were intended to protect information, but instead they strangled initiative. In trying to defend against an unseen adversary, the enemy constrained his own ability to adapt, turning caution into paralysis. This paralysis was not immediately visible on the battlefield, but it manifested in missed opportunities and delayed responses. When rapid action was required, hesitation intervened. When adaptation was necessary, procedures resisted change. The tempo of operations fell out of alignment with the pace of the war itself. Meanwhile, American forces operated with a clarity of intent that allowed them to maintain momentum even amid uncertainty. The intelligence war had reached a stage where it no longer needed constant reinforcement. Its effects were self-sustaining. The enemy's doubts fueled mistakes. Mistakes generated new information, and new information deepened the advantage. This feedback loop required no dramatic intervention. It functioned quietly, predictably, and devastatingly. For those observing from within the enemy's ranks, the sense of loss was not always tied to territory or manpower. It was tied to comprehension. They felt increasingly unable to grasp the shape of the war they were fighting. Without understanding, effort lost meaning. Without meaning, endurance faded. The struggle became mechanical rather than purposeful. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the intelligence advantage had done more than influence individual outcomes. It had reshaped the entire strategic environment. The war was no longer a contest of equal wills. It was an asymmetric struggle where one side acted with foresight and coherence, while the other reacted under a growing fog of uncertainty. And once a war reaches that point, reversal becomes not just unlikely, but nearly impossible. By this stage of the conflict, the intelligence advantage had reshaped not only strategy, but the very way the war was perceived by those fighting it. The enemy no longer experienced the war as a series of choices, but as a narrowing corridor where every option led to the same outcome. This sense of inevitability did not emerge from defeat on the battlefield alone, but from the growing awareness that initiative had slipped away permanently. Even when opportunities appeared, they felt illusory, fragile, and already compromised. This erosion of initiative had profound consequences. War demands momentum, not only in movement, but in belief. Once belief falters, coordination suffers, and once coordination weakens, even superior numbers and firepower lose their effectiveness. The enemy still possessed capable soldiers and formidable equipment, but these assets were increasingly misaligned, applied too late or in the wrong place. Intelligence dominance does not need to destroy strength, it only needs to misdirect it. For American planners, this phase represented the culmination of years of disciplined effort. Intelligence was no longer treated as a separate domain, but as an integral part of every decision. Planning, execution, and assessment formed a continuous loop, constantly refining understanding and reducing uncertainty. This loop allowed mistakes to be corrected quickly and successes to be amplified efficiently. It was not perfection that defined the system, but adaptability. What made this adaptability so powerful was that it operated without spectacle. There were no announcements declaring informational superiority, no visible signs that the enemy was being systematically outpaced. From the outside, operations appeared cautious, sometimes even conservative. But beneath that surface lay an extraordinary level of awareness that allowed risk to be calculated rather than guessed. American forces did not move faster than necessary because speed was no longer the primary advantage. Knowledge was. This contrast became increasingly apparent to those on the opposing side who could still see clearly. Some began to recognize that the war they were fighting no longer resembled the one they had prepared for. Traditional measures of success no longer applied. Tactical brilliance could not compensate for strategic blindness. Even flawless execution could not overcome decisions made with incomplete understanding. As pressure mounted, leadership faced an impossible dilemma. To act boldly risked exposure. To act cautiously ceded momentum. Every choice carried cost, and none promised reward. This condition, more than any single defeat, drained the energy required to sustain resistance. The war became exhausting not only physically but cognitively. Constant uncertainty is one of the most punishing environments a human mind can endure. Meanwhile, the American system continued to function with remarkable steadiness. Information flowed, decisions were made, and actions were taken with an assurance that did not rely on optimism or bravado. This steadiness transmitted confidence throughout the chain of command. Soldiers sensed that their actions were part of a larger design, even if they did not fully understand it. That sense of purpose reinforced cohesion and resilience, qualities that matter deeply in prolonged conflict. By now, the intelligence war had achieved its ultimate objective. It had not simply revealed enemy plans. It had reshaped enemy behavior. The opposing side was no longer acting freely, but responding reflexively, constrained by fear of exposure and haunted by the suspicion that every move was already known. This psychological containment was more effective than any physical barrier. In this environment, the outcome of the war no longer depended on dramatic breakthroughs. It depended on consistency, on continuing to make better-informed decisions day after day, while the enemy struggled to regain a clarity that had already slipped beyond reach. The balance had shifted so completely that the final phase of the war became less about contest and more about conclusion. And with that shift, the end was no longer a matter of possibility, but of time. By the time the war reached its final moments, the intelligence struggle that had shaped it was largely invisible to the public, yet unmistakable to those who had lived within it. The collapse that followed was not sudden, and it was not dramatic in the way history often portrays endings. It was quiet, incremental, and deeply internal. Long before surrender documents were signed, the war had already ended in the minds of those who understood what had been lost. Control, clarity, and the ability to shape events rather than merely endure them. What the United States had achieved was not simply an advantage in information, but a transformation in how war itself was conducted. Intelligence had ceased to be reactive. It had become anticipatory. Decisions were no longer driven by fear of surprise, but by confidence in understanding. This shift allowed American forces to apply pressure selectively, conserve strength, and avoid unnecessary sacrifice. Victory was pursued not through exhaustion alone, but through coherence. For the enemy, the final phase of the war felt less like a struggle and more like an unraveling. Plans continued to be made, orders continued to be issued, but they lacked the force they once carried. Without trust in secrecy, without faith in initiative, action lost its meaning. The machinery of command still existed, but its purpose had eroded. The war effort persisted out of obligation rather than belief. This is the quiet truth that often escapes historical narratives focused on battles and leaders. Wars do not end only when armies are defeated. They end when understanding collapses. When one side can no longer imagine a path to success that is not already known and neutralized. When every decision feels like a step into uncertainty, and every delay feels like confirmation of defeat. The American approach to intelligence during World War II ensured that this collapse occurred gradually, almost imperceptibly, but irreversibly. It denied the enemy the clarity required to recover. It turned secrecy into a liability and information into inevitability, and it did so without spectacle, without declaration, and without revealing the full extent of its reach. In the aftermath, many of those who had fought on the opposing side struggled to articulate what had gone wrong. They spoke of missed opportunities, of bad timing, of failures that never fully made sense. Few could see the larger pattern, because it had been designed to remain unseen. Yet the pattern was there, consistent and unbroken, shaping outcomes across continents and years. What remains, looking back, is a lesson that extends far beyond World War II. Modern conflict is not defined solely by strength or courage, but by understanding. The side that learns faster, adapts more efficiently, and sees more clearly will always hold the advantage even when facing formidable opposition. This truth, once revealed, cannot be unlearned. World War II demonstrated that victory does not always announce itself with noise and spectacle. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through preparation, coordination, and the disciplined use of information. The United States did not merely fight the war it was given, it redefined the war itself. And in doing so, it ensured that when the fighting finally stopped, the outcome was not a surprise to those who had been paying attention all along.